as I said in the previous video, I want to walk through the idea of risk management with you. Let's define some terms that are related to risk management. First of all is the idea of an asset. Now, an asset can be any number of things that are a benefit to a company or an individual. Information can be an asset, hardware equipment can be an asset, human users are assets. Anything of value to you or the business is considered an asset. Next, a threat. A threat is any agent that seeks to harm one of those assets. And a vulnerability is going to be the avenue of attack that that threat is going to use to get at that particular asset. So threat is the agent, vulnerability is the pathway, and asset is the target. Now, in any organization, there are going to be a large amount of assets that need protecting, and many vulnerabilities or avenues of attack at those assets, and many threats seeking to do harm to those assets. Not all of them carry the same risk. Risk is going to be the measurement of the probability or impact of a particular threat causing harm to a particular asset. The probability or likelihood that a threat is going to be successful, and the impact or the cost, the value of the loss of that particular asset is what we're looking at when we consider risk management. Of course, calculating that probability and impact can be quite challenging. When it comes to the probability, how likely an event or how likely a threat is to occur, we tend to speak in broad terms. Is it low probability or high probability? If we want a more detailed analysis, we could consider, is this going to happen daily, weekly, monthly, once a year, once every 10 years, or try and quantify the likelihood or the probability that an event is going to occur in a given time span. But at a bare minimum, we need to consider whether or not a threat is a high probability, very likely to happen, or a low probability, unlikely to happen. Along those same lines, when we consider impact, it may be difficult to quantify the impact of an event or a threat succeeding in attacking an asset. It's difficult to put numbers on the importance or the value of data, or our employees for that matter. However, once again, we can talk in broad terms about the impact. Is it going to have a high impact to the company or the value of that asset, or is it going to have a low impact to that value? And similarly, if we want a more detailed analysis of each of those different values, we can look at the actual dollar amount or the expected gain or loss based on the loss of an asset. Of course, in an ideal world, we would address every threat and eliminate every vulnerability. But in the real world, we can't do that. And so we're going to use the process of risk management in order to try and contain or reduce the risk of each of those different threats as much as possible. Risk management is a three-step process. The first step is threat modeling. The second step is risk analysis. And the third step is actually managing that risk. Threat modeling is simply the process of sitting down and thinking through what assets do we have, how are they vulnerable, and what threats are going to seek to exploit those particular assets. Once we've identified a list of threats, and that's an ongoing process, by the way. It's not like we sit down one day and identify all the threats that are possible. New threats emerge every day. But once we've identified a list of threats, we're going to start doing what's called risk analysis, where we actually calculate or compare the probability and impact of the different threats in our list. Now, typically we're going to talk in broad terms as far as high or low probability, high or low risk. And we can create a matrix with 4 regions: high probability, high risk, high probability, low risk, low probability, high risk, and low probability, low risk. Each of the threats that we identify should end up in one of those 4 quadrants. Of course, we're going to want to pay the most attention to the threats that end up in the high probability, high impact quadrant. But we may also want to consider those that end up in high probability, low impact, or low probability but high impact. This helps us to prioritize the resources that we use in managing this risk. Which brings us to our last step, actually managing the risk. Now, the goal of risk management is to reduce the probability and or impact of any given threat. We may not be able to completely eliminate it, but if we can get it out of that high probability, high impact quadrant and into the low probability, low impact quadrant, we've significantly reduced the threat to the overall system. As an example, consider disk failure. In a server environment where hundreds of disk drives are running 24/7, the probability that a disk will fail is very high. Similarly, depending on the RAID array redundancy between systems and backup systems in place, that drive failure could potentially have a very high impact. Take a moment and consider what measures could you put in place in order to reduce either the probability or the impact of that drive failure. Let's start with probability. What can we do to reduce the probability of a drive failure in a server environment with lots of disks? Well, the first thing that we can do is actually increase the quality of our disks, perhaps move to solid state where possible, or make sure that we're using enterprise class hard drives in order to ensure the longevity of those drives. There are also several other environmental factors such as temperature, humidity, and shock absorption that can aid in keeping those hard drives running for a longer period of time. On the impact side of things, we could reduce the impact of a single drive failure by changing the RAID level that our drives are using in order to increase redundancy, or by mirroring between server systems to reduce the impact of a single failed drive. Now realize that while all of these measures that we've put in place, changing RAID levels, having spares around, making sure we have quality equipment, and controlling the environment as best we can, while that reduces the probability and impact of that particular risk of a drive failing, it doesn't necessarily eliminate it completely. A drive may still fail because of a manufacturer defect or other factor, and the impact may still be severe, but we've done the best that we can to reduce the probability and impact as best we can. And this is really our goal. We can't eliminate all of the threats. If we could, we would. But what we can do is put measures in place to mitigate threats by reducing their probability and impact to a reasonable level. Now, of course, not all threats can be addressed in the same ways. And in fact, some will be more costly than others. Some threats can be addressed simply by using passwords, which cost nothing to implement. Other threats may cost tens of thousands of dollars to mitigate. But this is why we have this process of risk management, to consider which risks are of the utmost importance to spend our money mitigating so that we can have the safest system possible. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how do I know what threats my system faces? Well, once you know what assets you have, you can start to consider the threats that you know about related to those assets. Beyond that, personal experience, Google searches, and common vulnerability databases will round out your list of threats that are known for that particular system. The risk management process, and specifically the threat modeling step, starts with very broad threats, and as time goes on can be refined to include more specific threats targeted at specific assets. Even risk analysis, starting with broad strokes of low probability, high probability, or low impact, high impact, can be refined and calculated to know exactly what the probability is and what the cost or value or the impact is down to a dollar amount so that risk can be assessed in a more quantitative manner. Now, while all of the mitigation techniques and measures that we can put in place to improve system security is really outside the scope of this class, I want to consider two different categories of measures that we might put in place and give you some examples of those for use in your course project. The two categories of risk mitigation strategies are preventative and reactive. And as the names would imply, preventative is really a measure that's designed to reduce the probability and impact of an event before it happens, or to prevent that event from ever occurring. While reactive measures are measures that we put in place after the fact, or something that's designed to respond to an event. Using the example that we had earlier of drive failure, preventative measures to reduce probability and impact include purchasing quality equipment or using proper RAID levels to ensure redundancy. Reactive measures would include replacing drives as soon as they fail so that those RAID arrays can be rebuilt, or restoring from backups if a drive or array completely fails. Consider also network security. Now, there are many different tools that we can use to promote network security or to improve our network security, such as firewalls, proxies, intrusion detection systems, and intrusion prevention systems. Firewalls are considered a preventative measure. They're trying to reduce the probability of an event occurring by reducing the amount of threats that make it onto the network. An intrusion detection system, however, is more of a reactive measure. It's identifying a threat and then notifying a human user who can then react to that problem, thus reducing the impact or reducing the threat to other assets. Just a last note on threats. Realize that not all threats are malicious. Now, we do live in a day when there are a vast number of security threats that are due to malicious individuals, either promoting malicious code, attempting to crack into systems that they should not have access to, or attempting to exploit our human users on a system. There are also several threats that are more passive or non-malicious. Things like natural disasters, hardware failure, power outages, interruptions of service, etc., that are not necessarily malicious in nature, but are still a threat to the assets that we have in our system.